Hi, everybody. This is Gad Saad. I've got another fantastic guest for you today, Frank Gaffney, whom I'll introduce in a second. But I first wanted to say hello, Frank. How you doing?
I'm very well. Thank you, God.
A real pleasure to have you. So, Frank is the founder and president of the Center for Security Policy. You'll tell us a bit about it in a second. Now, I am, I guess, a very short degree of separation away from a former, very famous president of the United States, Ronald Reagan, because you served as his Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear Forces and Arms Control Policy. You also served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International
That's
Security
great.
Policy. You're the host of Secure Freedom Radio, a nationally syndicated radio show. And you are the publisher and associate author, and we'll talk about this, of Sharia, the Threat to America, with the ominous sounding 19-member Team B Part 2. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you.
Thank you so much. So I thought we'd start. Of course, many of your detractors, paint you as a hate monger, a hate peddler, an Islamophobe. You're a conspiracist. You're a delusional guy. Now, I'm assuming that all this comes from the fact that you take the position that there are dangers associated with certain Islamic doctrines that we should be wary of. Is that the extent to which they are labeling you as a hate monger and a conspiracist?
Well, of course, I can't speak for my detractors, but what I will say on my behalf is I think they use such invectives and ad hominem attacks because they can't really refute the substance of what I'm saying. And indeed, I think the principal fault they find with me is that I'm warning of what's now palpable. I think the vast majority of Americans and indeed people throughout the free world are now becoming clued up as to the true nature of the global jihad movement and to varying degrees at least, the doctrine that impels it, which its adherents call Sharia. And I continue to warn about that, and yet to have someone really credibly, authoritatively, effectively gainsay what I'm warning of here, and consequently what I get is, as I say, a lot of character assassination instead.
Now, is that typically coming from Muslim apologists, or are you also getting this sort of blowback from the typical sort of ostrich apologist who's a Westerner progressive guy? I guess you're getting a bit of both, right?
Yeah, there's what I call a red-green axis at work. There's a unmistakable alliance that has been forged between those who are actively pursuing, in the name of Islamic supremacism, a program that they embrace because it is what they believe to be God's will, Allah's will. And then there are, of course, people, unlikely as this might seem, on the left who nonetheless are supportive of these Islamists, even though it is absolutely predictable that if the jihadists succeed, the first people put to the knife will be the very leftists that are helping possible their assault on the West. But the left seems to think that because they are equally committed to the destruction of Western civilization, that there can be effective partners, even though the long-term prospects for them are not very good.
Well, I've cited the book by, and I'm sure you probably are familiar with it, the book by Jamie Glazoff, titled "United in Hate," which exactly speaks to the alliance that you just mentioned. Are you familiar with that book? You are, yes. Can you hear my audio?
I with Jamie, I I have not
Oh,
uh,
you're breaking up.
read his book, but I am definitely familiar with his work and his thesis indeed.
Right. So before we get into
Well, you were picking up a little there too.
oh, really? Okay, so maybe if it continues, then I'll hang up and we'll try again. How's it going now? Can you hear me?
It's coming and going.
Okay.
I think if you you'll be fine.
Okay. So as somebody who's worked in government, did you start seeing sort of the rejection of the warnings that you were giving way back during your era in government? Or is this something that has gone on sort of delusional steroid in the last 10 years or so? Or is this a phenomenon that's been with us where people simply don't wish to see the writing on the wall? How do you see that, that phenomenon? Can you hear me?
Well, yeah, I think the way to think about this is in simply one phase of a many, many generational war. I call it the war for the free world. It is a relentless effort on the part of people who are committed to totalitarianism of one
Oh, you're breaking up. I
to
can't.
impose their will on the rest of us.
Right.
And the way I think of it is that we are confronting the current generation's phase of what I believe is best described as the war for the free world. And that war is one that, like previous generations, is facing a totalitarian enemy that seeks the destruction of Western civilization. And there are differences, to be sure, between the Nazis and the communists and the fascists and the imperial Japanese and the like. But the current threat from totalitarians of the Islamist stripe is more similar than it is different. In fact, I kind of think of what we're confronting these days as communism with a god, which turns out to be a lot more dangerous than the one that didn't have it, because these are people who believe that killing themselves in furtherance of their agenda will result in heavenly rewards. Atheists who didn't believe there was anything beyond this life were easier, I think, to deter. But the point is that going back, as you've mentioned, to my time with the Reagan administration during the Cold War, remember very vividly being criticized for thinking that we had to fight, as Ronald Reagan did, the totalitarians of that time, namely Soviet communism. And I was very proud to play a small part in helping execute his strategy for defeating the USSR. I think a similar strategy is needed today, and I guess for arguing that case, I'm as criticized now as I was back in the Reagan administration.
But I guess there is a greater reticence for people to. So it's not only that the current, nastiness stemming from Islam is worse than some of the other totalitarian ideas, precisely because they are so motivated in a sort of supernatural manner. But I also think that the response of Westerners makes it more dangerous because they are more reticent to criticize an idea that is cloaked in the robe of religion, right? It's simply gauche to do that. It's inappropriate because we can all point to some really lovely Muslim that we're friends with and who's a decent human being. So I think that adds an extra layer of complexity to tackling the problem, no?
The way I would put it is that the Islamic supremacists have very, very clearly figured out that if they can masquerade their totalitarian ideology and program under the cloak of religion, it's not just that we will find it gauche to criticize them, they will enjoy the protections of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So it's kind of a get out of jail free card, if you will. And this is one of the reasons why I believe it's both accurate and necessary to point out that what they are about is not religion. It is Sharia. And they explicitly describe Sharia not as a religion, but as law. And that law happens to be utterly inconsistent with Article 6 of our Constitution, which, as you may know, makes explicit that the Constitution of the United States is the supreme law of the land. And you cannot legally try to inject an anti-constitutional legal system in our country. And once we're clear about that, that these Islamic supremacists do not enjoy constitutional protections, but in fact are a threat to the Constitution, I think it becomes far easier to take them on, and I'm hoping take them down.
Now, of course, many Islamic scholars will get on TV. I can think of Imam Rauf, the guy who was sort of most famously associated with the Ground Zero mosque attempts, where he comes on CNN with a straight face and says, "But 99% of Sharia law is perfectly consistent with the American Constitution." And as I hear this kind of nonsense, and I watch the CNN interviewer completely accept this at face value, I'm taken aback, right? Because you couldn't think of making up a set of legal codes that were more antithetical to the American Constitution, yet there's never any blowback against these kinds of statements. Is it because the CNN journalist is simply unaware, or is he's complicitous in this diabolical design?
It's a good question, and I don't know the specific interviewer you're talking about, but I think the phenomenon, the syndrome, if you will, is sufficiently widespread that we can comment on it. And it seems to me that it's more likely that what's operating is complete ignorance of the truth on the part of most in the mainstream media, as they're called, combined with not a small amount of fear that if they actually challenge what these Islamists like Rauf are saying, that they will be threatened or at risk of, at the very best, sort of being ostracized by people in their profession, people whose high regard they value in perhaps academic circles or political circles, as well as their colleagues. Or worse, they may actually be physically threatened, perhaps even with death, because as Rauf knows very well, and as do jihadists of other stripes, it is a capital offense to, cast Islam in a negative light or otherwise give offense to Muslims. And so these are very practical considerations for a lot of people, and it's not just the mainstream press. It just happens to be a particular problem with them. And I would say that I give great credit to a friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, who is a reformist within the Muslim community and who is very, very familiar with this practice. He's recently written a series of letters to the presidents of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, the editors, executive editors of the Washington Post and the New York Times, basically taking them to task for giving this kind of platform reflexively to those like Rauf to engage in what he and others have understood to be the tradition of taqiyya, or dissembling or lying for that faith.
Now, you mentioned Zuhdi Jasser. I very much appreciate his relentless efforts, but I guess if I might challenge one aspect of what he does, I think he and other very well-meaning Islamic reformers suffer from what I call unicorn Islam, right? And that is where every individual who is otherwise a secular liberal Muslim who would like to see Islam be reformed will create a narrative whereby, true Islam is not really against Jews. True Islam loves homosexuals. So depending on the individual who is doing the sort of attempt at reformation, they will create this unicorn Islam. And I think, notwithstanding all of his great efforts in endless ways, I think we need to be a bit more honest about what true Islam is. And I think that's where I might disagree with some of his positions. Do you agree with my concern here, or do you think I'm being unfair to him?
I have made it a matter of principle, really, to try to avoid commenting on who is a Muslim, who is not a Muslim, whose characterization of the faith is correct, whose is incorrect, believing that ought to be sorted out by Muslims. What I believe and I think what Dr. Jasser believes, because I've heard him now talk about it a lot, is that Sharia, which he's described as man-made law, which is the ultimate apostasy as far as, of course, the Islamists are concerned, because they insist, as you know, Gad, that it is divinely dictated law.
Sure.
He has said that is unacceptable. That is anti-constitutional. I mean, I think he would use exactly the same words that you and I have just used. And that's the point on which I think we can forge a common, purpose in trying to prevent the efforts being made by those in his community, who, by the way, include the authorities of Islam, to impose Sharia, either through violent jihad or through stealthy jihad, through immigration, through what's called zakat, or material support for the jihadists. These are things that are taking place in our country, and I think we can and must work with those like Zuhdi Jasser, who don't want to live under Sharia any more than the rest of us do, and can bring a certain perspective to bear on it that many in the West find more acceptable than hearing such criticisms from the likes of thee and me.
And I guess another way to sort of speak to what we're saying is to draw the dichotomy between, I think recently Ayaan Hirsi Ali referred to the Meccan versus Medinan Islam, right? And so in a sense, this kind of links to a spiritual Islam versus political Islam. The Meccan one being the more spiritual one, the Medinan becoming a lot more bellicose and more political. And so in that sense, I'm guessing that Sharia would fall under the political aspect. And so what we need to do is find a way to have Muslims still practice their faith peacefully by sort of restricting the scope of their faith to the Meccan period. Is that a fair sort of description of the situation?
Well, I have great respect for Ayaan Hirsi Ali. I think she's a remarkable person. I prefer, as I said, to avoid discussion of the faith altogether. I just don't see it serves any purpose. People practicing the authentically religious facets of Islam are protected under our Constitution in doing so. It is purely the political elements which are codified in Sharia that are impermissible in our country. And I think there's plenty to do just focusing on stopping Sharia.
Gotcha.
So that's where I'm devoting my effort.
Well, I spoke to Andrew McCarthy, who's both of our, more of your friend than mine, but I've gotten to know him and I highly respect his work. And I think as a lawyer, we got into a discussion of, could it ever be conceivable that, I'm not exactly sure of how the details would go legally, but that certain aspects of Islam would be considered seditious. And I think what I hear in what you're saying is that those elements would precisely be Sharia law, to the extent that we can argue that the contents of Sharia law are so fundamentally antithetical to the American Constitution, we could flag that as seditious and render it illegal. Would that be correct in saying?
Look, Andy McCarthy has forgotten more about all of this than I will ever know. I hold him in the highest regard. So basically, anything he says, I'm good with. I just would put it this way: if by its very nature, Sharia is an alternative form of law to ours in the United States, I'm talking about, and more to the point, it's not just a different form of law, it is antithetical to our Constitution and the freedoms that are guaranteed as God-given. It is, in fact, illegal to practice it here. And I think that's where we have to start. First and foremost, we must not bring more people into this country who believe it is God's will that they try to impose this doctrine on the rest of us. I believe it is important that we not extend citizenship to more people who believe that they must impose Sharia on the rest of us. The question, which Newt Gingrich, of course, has engaged rather vigorously in the past few days, is what do you do about the potentially quite significant numbers of Muslims in this country who are citizens, certainly are here already, who are similarly of the belief that they must, it is their duty to try to force the entire country to submit to this brutally repressive totalitarian doctrine. That's a next order question. I think the first order of business is, as I say, to stop immigration of Sharia adherent Muslims and to prevent the further citizenship, naturalization of those who aspire to this anti-constitutional doctrine.
Okay, so God is God or the devil is in the details. How would we go? I'm sure you haven't thought of all the possible details, the practical details, but how does one go about doing exactly what you're saying? So if I concede that it is absolutely clear that what you're saying is true, how do we take 100 Muslims, some of whom would be exactly the ones that you would prefer to avoid, others of whom are not, and genuinely be able to sort them into the two camps? Is it ever feasible to be able to do that?
Well, there's the mechanical piece of it, and then there's the policy piece of it. Let me start with the policy piece of it. I think you begin by making clear, for example, let's just stay with the immigration bit, that there will no longer be visas given to Sharia adherent Muslims seeking to enter the United States on a permanent basis, and they will be subjected, for the purposes of the mechanical question, to a rigorous inquiry, both in terms of their background and in terms of interviews by consular officers, to establish whether that is in fact their objective. Now, again, I mentioned this tradition, indeed this obligation of engaging in dissimulation for the service of the faith.
Exactly.
Taqiyya. So you must expect, particularly once this is established to be the practice, that there will be some who will lie about it. But if they do, and you've established the record, should they actually be admitted, then you have a basis upon which to expel them if and when you discover that they, in fact, are violating their representations. So these are the sorts of things that I believe are perfectly constitutional, perfectly legal, perfectly sensible, and indeed absolutely necessary.
So how far is the effort? I know that different states have independently tried to amend their laws to, I think they now no longer mention it as sort of anti-Sharia, but rather anti-foreign laws. How many of the 50 states have so far successfully passed bills that that make it illegal to introduce foreign laws within state law?
Well, it's not quite right to characterize it that way.
Okay.
The bills in question have sort of generically been known as American laws for American courts. There are 10 states that have adopted in one form or another this, again, I think eminently sensible and absolutely constitutional principle that in the courts of that state, foreign laws that violate the constitutional rights of American citizens or state public policy may not be used to adjudicate, whatever the dispute might be. This has principally been a problem in family law matters, but to varying degrees, it's clear that the Islamists among us hope to do what they have done elsewhere, notably in the United Kingdom, which is either to get Sharia used to adjudicate matters in the courts of the state, or, as in Britain specifically, a parallel system of justice in which Sharia is administered, not American constitutional laws and those enacted pursuant to it. And this is, I think, a very important fight, and I'm very gratified that 10 state legislatures have seen it as we do, that it needs to be stopped rather than allowed to metastasize.
For some of our listeners who may not be familiar with some of the details of Sharia law, I thought that I would mention one example of specific contents of Sharia law that are perfectly contrary and antithetical to the American Constitution. And then if you want to add any additional examples, then of course feel free to do so. So the one that I love to give is the one that specifically looks at the severity of a crime as a function of the identity of the perpetrator and the victim, right? So I mean, if there's a murder, depending on whether the murderer and the murdered person is a Muslim or not, and so on, will determine the punishment. Now, by definition, you couldn't think of something that is more antithetical to the American Constitution. Do you have other examples that are sort of very tangible and palpable that can help educate people about how Sharia is different from the American Constitution?
Oh, sure. I mean, that is one, of course. The idea that a woman is only worth a half of a man,
right,
in terms of testimony, that a woman who is raped can only bring charges against the assailant if she has 4 male witnesses. The fact that a woman does not have rights to child custody. A woman does not have the same rights as a man to divorce, in a divorce setting, to the family property. That homosexuals can be killed. That apostates can be killed. That women can be beaten, indeed are supposed to be beaten in appropriate ways, mind you. I mean, it goes on, and the bottom line is this: it is all about a proposition that is, as we've discussed, antithetical to the Constitution, namely that only God can make the law, that democracy, that the Constitution of the United States, the government that it establishes, the process by which we are governed in a representative form through our elected representatives making laws on our behalf, and all the rest. All of that is absolutely impermissible under Sharia. So it couldn't be more clear that this is not only an abomination, I think, but it is an utter affront to what we believe and what we stand for and how we have been governed. And I think all of us basically want to continue to be governed.
Now, both you and I disagree with the next position that I'm going to summarize, but it's worth bringing it out because many apologists will use it. So, for example, famously, Reza Aslan, whom I'm guessing you're familiar with, will say something to the following effect. Well, yeah, I mean, whatever Frank Gaffney just said is one interpretation, one harsh interpretation of Sharia. But Sharia is practiced in endless different ways, depending on context, depending on individuals, and therefore it is infinitely malleable. So in a sense, he is being very unfair to Sharia by pretending that it is this very sort of rigid set of codes. How do we tackle this apologetics?
Well, again, I just follow the facts. The fact is that going back to the 13th century, there has been a codification of Sharia in a book known as Reliance of the Traveler. And this very lengthy, very comprehensive book is endorsed by the authorities of Islam, notably Al-Azhar University in Cairo and the various theologians and royal families of the House of Saud and the government of Jordan and Qatar and on and on. The question is not, are there alternative Sharias? There is only one Sharia. It is true that in parts of the world, Sharia is enforced to different degrees, or in some cases simply practiced in different degrees. But that's a totally different thing than saying that you can just sort of have your own Sharia, or that the stuff that is authoritatively recognized, codified, and practiced is just an interpretation. That's not so.
And by the way, and I know you'd like to sort of restrict much of our conversation to Sharia, but if I may, I think what you just said also applies perfectly to the different qualifiers that are typically used with Islam, right? Radical Islam, extremist Islam, militant Islam, moderate Islam. I think that those are all incorrect. There's only one Islam as codified in the Qur'an, in the Hadiths, in the Seerah, the biography of Muhammad. Now, different people can pick and choose which parts they wish to take seriously. The example that I usually give is a very banal one, say from my Jewish background. I choose to eat pork and to eat shrimp. That's not because I practice a moderate form of Judaism. It's because I choose to ignore those particular kashrut laws in Judaism. And so frankly, it weakens the general honesty of the discourse when people constantly try to come up with all sorts of qualifiers to qualify what Islam is. I understand that you want to stick mainly to Sharia, but do you agree that this is a worthy position that I'm enunciating?
My view of this, of course, is that I'm not competent to speak to the faith. I would simply say that, yes, the authorities of the faith make no bones about it, that there is one faith, and that it is Sharia. Now, there are people, Reza and Zudi and others, who will say, no, my faith is different than what they've described. And I leave that to them to sort it out. I just believe we've got to be clear that there is an authoritative practice of Islam and Sharia. And ignoring that fact, or listening particularly to those in the Muslim Brotherhood, notably, who dissemble about that fact, allowing those Islamic supremacists to guide our policies, not just our understanding of the challenge we're facing, but our policies in terms of dealing with it, is a formula for disaster.
So speaking of policies, let me come back to a point that we started off with, and namely sort of the unwillingness of many of our political leaders to sort of speak clearly about what the threats are. So I thought I would read you some quotes that span both political aisles, and then see whether you can help us understand whether people are genuinely that ignorant or whether they're just being politically pragmatic. Anyways, let's see where we can go. So George Bush, immediately after 9/11, went to a mosque and said, the face of terror is not the true faith of Islam. That's not what Islam is all about. Islam is peace. Then Barack Obama said in a United Nations address, the future must not belong to those who slander the prophet of Islam. Let me just mention one or two others. Hillary Clinton tweeted, let's be clear, Islam is not our adversary. Muslims are peaceful and tolerant people and have nothing whatsoever to do with terrorism. And you may know these two exchanges, one between Representative Dan Lundgren questioning Paul Stockton, the then Assistant Defense Secretary for Homeland Security, and also Representative Lamar Smith questioning Attorney General Eric Holder, both of whom were simply unwilling. It was like pulling teeth to even utter the word radical Islam, Sharia, anything relating to the faith. So do you think that in each of these cases it's just political correctness gone haywire, or do people genuinely believe that Frank Gaffney is completely gone bonkers by actually thinking that there is any link between Islam and the global mayhem?
Well, again, I don't feel comfortable speaking for my detractors. They do it rather frequently themselves. I will just tell you, I think, as with my comment about the media, there is a combination when you look at some of these political figures of ignorance of the truth on the one hand, and perhaps fear, uh, maybe not so much personal fear, but fear of the consequences of uh, being more forthright, shall we say, about the nature of Islamic supremacism, the Sharia that animates it, the jihad Sharia compels, and so on. Um, and at the very least, I think we have to recognize that in the case of George W. Bush, in the case of Barack Obama, in the case of Hillary Clinton, in the case of uh, Eric Holder, it is absolutely demonstrable they were all and have been, in some cases on an ongoing basis, subjected to highly successful influence operations by members of the Muslim Brotherhood. So, to the extent that what you've just described, God, is the Muslim Brotherhood taqiyya, the false narratives, the lies that are designed to disable us, to leave us. And Ted Cruz had a marvelous hearing on this subject about a month ago now in the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Oversight, entitled Willful Blindness.
Right.
And some of that is unquestionably a function of, some of the factors that I'm talking about that are relatively innocent, but some of it is we have been duped, deluded, and otherwise subverted by Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamic supremacist operatives inside the wire of our government.
And so in that sense, when one sees, the actual violent mayhem, while of course tragic to anyone who directly suffers either from being maimed or killed, the greater battle is an informational battle, correct? And I mean, that's why I do what I do. I mean, right, as an academic, I'm an evolutionary behavioral scientist, so it's not as though Islam is within my scientific purview. But as a public intellectual, I speak about this because I feel compelled to at least weigh in my small voice to the great discussion. And so, do you feel that as hopefully more people come out and speak openly about this, we can win the informational war? Or, I mean, I'm looking for some optimism here, Frank. Or do you think that the other camp is so well organized that we are inching slowly but surely to the abyss of darkness?
Well, sadly, we certainly are. If
Right.
best case is inching, worst case is we're galloping towards it. But look, we have no choice but to counter this jihad in all of its manifestations. Unfortunately, in part, I'm afraid, as a result of this civilization jihad against us, the success of the subversion of the Brotherhood and its ilk, we're not doing a very good job against even the violent jihad. I mean, we spend endless amounts of time trying after the fact, as I know you're aware, to wonder why would somebody go shoot a bunch of homosexuals in Orlando?
It's
Or
a lack of exposure to art, Frank.
well, or some repressed psychological disorder. I mean, look, or too many guns. I mean,
Right.
the trouble actually is that if we are not clear-eyed about the danger that we're facing and why, if we are not willing to take actually to heart the express determination of these jihadists to force us to submit or die, we will unfortunately go right off that precipice, I think. But we do have, I think, especially with the object lesson of what is happening to people like us in Europe at the moment, the opportunity to pull back from the brink.
Well,
But we have to be about it. And I would just say, if I may, that one of the things that we're doing at our Center for Security Policy is helping to mount a counter jihad campaign. And if people are interested in learning more about it, please visit counterjihad.org. quebec.com.
Before I let you go, Frank, I know you have to leave soon. I'll just add, since you mentioned the European context, that in a sense, Quebec, where I live, Montreal, Quebec, is sort of etched somewhere between the United States and Europe in terms of, heading towards the abyss of darkness, in that it seems as though Quebec is trying desperately to replicate all of the errors of Europe. And there are several reasons for that. I mean, one, certainly our latest prime minister seems to be sympathetic to what's happening in Europe and is trying to replicate it here. But the unique Quebec experience of trying to protect the language heritage of Quebec has created this unbelievable blindness in the Quebec government, whereby they'd rather let in endless people from Sharia compliant places who speak French, rather than letting in somebody from Jamaica who may not speak French, and then they will face the threat of being swollen linguistically by the English monster. And so it's really quite astonishing to see how, you've got these otherwise really bright, intelligent, committed people who are committing these unbelievable errors. And I truly fear that Quebec, and our conversation will be hopefully recorded in infamy forever. I fear that in 5 or 10 years, we will have similar daily realities to what is happening in Quebec. Do you want to weigh in at all on that? Do you know enough about Quebec to either agree or disagree?
Well, I'm trying to follow what's happening in Quebec as best I can, God. I think one thing to monitor very closely, and I know you are, because it is a direct threat to you, is the assault on freedom of speech. And I guess there was a stay of execution when Bill 59 was pulled down recently. But I'm told, particularly with the Trudeau government's involvement, that there will be variations on the theme coming forward, either at the provincial level or at the national level, to essentially apply one of the leading edges of this civilization jihadist enterprise, now palpable in Europe, and to bring it to Canada, namely curbing so-called hate speech and criminalizing it. And this, of course, I'm sorry to say, is something that my own government has lent its support to in a fashion. We do have, of course, the First Amendment to the Constitution that's supposed to protect our freedom of expression. And yet, notably, Hillary Clinton, who presided over the adoption of Human Rights Council 1618 in the United Nations back in 2011, famously declared that we were going to use, quote, old-fashioned techniques of shaming and peer pressure to discourage that we abhor, unquote. And the point of this was to indicate that the United States is going to throw in with these other countries and governments and the European Union and so on in trying to prevent, and let's be clear, this isn't defamation of all religions, it's anything construed as defamation of Islam. And it's a very toxic thing because, with that freedom over the side, the rest are going to follow in short order.
You're referring specifically to the repeated attempts by the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, to introduce so-called global blasphemy laws. That's what you're referring to with Hillary Clinton, correct?
Well, I'm talking not so much about the serial efforts to do it. I'm talking about their success in accomplishing it in this form of Resolution 1618 in 2011. And now it's just a question of getting all of the member nations to formalize this, to adopt it as part of their domestic code, and as I say, to criminalize it in the way of stiff penalties.
Got you. So as we wrap this up, Frank, are there any projects, I know you just briefly mentioned the work that you do at the Center for Security Policy. Are there any projects that are not yet public that you might want to take this opportunity to tell us about and get the people excited about?
Well, it's not so much that it hasn't happened yet as it's an ongoing effort. I would just commend to your listeners, and you're obviously doing a wonderful job of educating them, but to the extent we might be able to help, We have a series of products at the Center for Security Policy's website. I mentioned counterjihad.com. You can find a lot of great stuff there too, but it's securefreedom.org. We have a series of monographs, I think 9 or 10 of them at the moment, of what we call our Civilization Jihad Reader series, which is intended to basically equip people to perceive accurately and understand the threat posed by these Muslim Brotherhood forays into our civil society institutions and governing agencies. When I say forays, I don't mean just walks through the park. I mean their penetration for the purpose of subverting and ultimately destroying these institutions. And it's fascinating, if chilling reading. There are more coming every day, practically, in this series and others, and you can get them all for free. Download them as PDFs at securefreedom.org.
Wonderful. I will put the links to all the things that you've mentioned at the bottom of the descriptor section of the clip. Hey, Frank, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure and honor chatting with you. I hope we can do it again. Please stay on the line for a second. Thank you so much again, Frank. Huh?
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Cheers.